Hello. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our February Max Weber lecture. It is a huge honor to have with us Professor Theda Skocpol today, and also the new director of the Max Weber program, Professor Richard Bellamy, who will introduce briefly Professor Skocpol and the lecture. I'll pass it over. Professor Skocpol will probably talk around 40 minutes, I understand, and then we'll open it up for questions and very brief comments, mostly questions. Okay.
Hello. Well, it's a great pleasure as well as an honor to be able to introduce Professor Skocpol. I was very pleased that I was able to have my visit here for rather more boring things coincide with the possibility of introducing her. Her many honors and publications will, I'm sure, be known to many of you. I was just saying to her that for me, she had a sort of influence in the sense that I remember well as an undergraduate reading her very first book on states and social revolutions just after it came out in 1979. And it had a sort of an effect in moving me from history, as I then was, towards a sort of historically and sociologically informed political science. And as she remarked, this is, in a sense, very much in the tradition of Max Weber, so it seems highly appropriate that she should be talking to us today. I think she's written on a wide diversity of topics, but what for me anyway brings them together in a certain sense is that as well as being rigorously in research terms, they're also scholarly and politically committed, and that seems particularly the case with the topic today, that of looking at the politics of global warming in the United States, which is an issue not just for the United States, but sadly for many countries in Europe as well. One thinks of the current floods in the UK and the fact that certain prominent members of the government party are still denying that it is anything to do with climate change. So I look very much forward to hearing her talk on making sense of the past and future politics of global warming in the United States.
That I'll want to come back, and what a beautiful setting you all have here, and I look forward to the chance to discuss the ideas I'll present in this lecture and in some of my meetings where I hope to get to know people individually over the next day. The work that I'm going to talk from today was a little bit unusual for me in my career in that I was commissioned to do it as a sort of retrospective policy report or a retrospective on a failed political incident. Many of you probably know me as a historically oriented social scientist who wrote about the French, Russian, and Chinese revolutions and about the development or the non-development of the American systems of social policy and health policy in comparison to various parts of Europe. I've also worked on social movements and voluntary associations and the way they've changed over time, particularly in the United States. So in a way, what I'm going to talk about today may seem like a departure, but it isn't really. Because I believe that comparative historical sociology or comparative historical institutional political science, I am happy to adopt either label for what I do, they're not just about the past. If we think about how politics, group clashes and coalitions, transformations of policies and institutions play out over time, then we ought to be able to say something even about things that are quite recent, and say something not about what will happen next, but what the forces are in play that will shape what will happen next. So 2 times in my career in recent years, I've been asked to look retrospectively at policy failures in the United States. We have a lot of them. I think they happen in Italy too, from what I read in the New York Times. I looked at the failure of the Clinton health policy in 1993-94, and more recently I've had the chance to write about the enactment of a similar attempt at regulated private insurance and universal access that's called Obamacare. And I'm still doing research on that. And in both of those projects, it was very helpful to be able to understand how political parties and social movements have interacted with the nitty-gritty of governing in a congressionally centered political system, which is what the United States has at the national level. So this project, I'm drawing in this lecture on this report that was originally put on the internet about a year ago called Naming the Problem. I was commissioned by the Rockefeller Family Fund, which is not the big Rockefellers, it's the small, more kind of left of center part of the Rockefeller panoply, to take a look at what happened in the United States in the first 2 years of Barack Obama's presidency, when there was an attempt to enact a cap and trade system that would commit the United States national government to gradually realigning the production and use of energy in our immense economy in a way that would open the possibilities for more global alliances to address the growing threat of global warming. So I took that commission, and I was told it would take a couple months, and of course I ended up taking a year. And I ended up looking much more broadly at what has happened to environmental politics in the United States in the context of what's happening to politics in the United States. I hope all of you here in Europe are sufficiently puzzled at what's happening in the United States, because some very strange things and some very extreme things are happening in US politics. And one of my most recent projects was to study the Tea Party as a top-down and bottom-up effort to pressure the Republican Party, one of our 2 major parties, to move to the not just to the right, but to the very far right. And that research figures in the story that I'll be telling today. So let me set the stage by just filling you in or reminding you, as the case may be, about the particular policy episode that my analysis seeks to unpack, both why it happened the way it did and what that says about the future of national political efforts to address global warming in the United States. And we'll get to that toward the end, and I look forward to the discussion and perhaps hearing some things about what has happened in Europe. When Barack Obama was inaugurated President of the United States in early 2009, that was the first time that a Democratic Party president had come to the White House in quite some time, since Bill Clinton, actually. And it was also a unique moment that happens only rarely in modern American politics, in which the president arrived in the White House at the same time that there were substantial majorities of Democrats in the House and the Senate. We're not a parliamentary system. the president doesn't direct a majority party very often. And so this, of course, was quite an amazing conjuncture, in addition to the fact that it's the first African-American president, and one that was seen as a harbinger of the future because he was supported by such strong, for U.S., strong voter turnout among younger voters and minority ethnic voters and African-Americans and women. It was also seen as a moment in which the direction of U.S. national policy, which of course has reverberations for what the world can do in various areas, might happen quite quickly and in a sustained way because of the fact that he had the majorities in our legislature to back him up. Now, there were lots and lots of movements and lots of policy groups that were ready to ask for action on their issues. I could go through a whole laundry list of them, but probably the two biggest ones were health care reform, the 10th effort over 100 years in the United States to create some kind of universal access to health insurance. That was a priority for many people in and around the Democratic Party. And the other really big priority and high hopes for bold action was on the climate change front, where a coalition of some business leaders and some professional national environmental organizations led by the Environmental Defense Fund, but including others as well, had been preparing for a number of years to try to ask Congress and to enact and the president to sign into law a cap and trade system that would make a start on changing the price of carbon, energy, and encouraging new kinds of energy production and use in the United States. So these were the two big reform efforts that powerful coalitions were geared up to push forward. Ultimately, health reform passed, barely, after 15 months, with only Democratic votes. On the cap and trade side, rapid progress occurred in 2009 in the first months of Obama's presidency, and the House of Representatives in June of 2009 passed a historic Waxman-Markey bill that was their version of a cap and trade system. Heavily negotiated, in many ways heavily compromised from the point of view of environmentalists, but nevertheless a huge breakthrough, and then it moved to the Senate. Over the next year in the U.S. Senate, one effort after another to put together the 60 votes out of 100 that would be needed to get major legislation through the Senate fell apart. In particular, Republicans who had in the past been willing to join bipartisan coalitions for cap and trade-like bills did not provide any votes, although they spent many months pretending they were going to provide votes before they didn't provide them. That's the way things happen in the U.S. John McCain, probably the most visible Republican who had been associated in the past with bipartisan bargains for a cap and trade type system, danced around it for many months and then did not go along. So finally, after about a year, the cap and trade legislation and various alternatives to it simply failed to be brought to a vote in the U.S. Senate. And that was just a few months before an election in which the far right of the Republican Party made astonishing gains. 60-some seats in the House of Representatives, taking control of the House, but even more important, huge gains throughout many U.S. states, creating supermajorities in key Midwestern as well as Southern and Western states that could be used to lock in their majorities at the national level as well. So I think it's fair to say that the effort to enact cap and trade was not only a failure in the sense of a fizzle, ultimately, it was part of a real boomerang or turnaround. It was one of the issues that helped radical right Republicans to make such astonishing gains in the 2010 election. So my mission when I came to this was to talk about what happened, why this failed, but also what the failure meant about the long-term evolution of environmental politics in the United States and its future possibilities. You see, in some ways, it's not a mystery why this legislation failed. When you need 60 out of 100 votes in the Senate, and the Democrats had 60, but included 5 to 8 from oil or gas producing states, or from states in the Midwestern part of the United States that use coal-fired electricity from coal-fired plants. It was known going in that there would be defections from the Democratic ranks, and certainly no way to discipline them. That doesn't happen in the United States. So there had to be Republicans. And once it was clear that no Republicans' votes would be forthcoming, then of course the legislation failed. So that's not the most interesting part of what I looked into. I transformed the question, and I actually think that's what good social scientists do. They don't just take the question that's handed to them, they change it. And I changed it in a couple of ways. I was curious why smart people thought in 2009, and particularly in 2010, that this could work. Where did the policy ideas that they were pursuing come from? What was their approach to trying to persuade Congress to enact this incredibly complex and in many ways costly legislation, since it would realign core functions in the U.S. economy? And why was it that they not only failed, but failed in a way that didn't seem to create possibilities for the future? Because that's what I'll be arguing in the end. I'll be arguing that the approach that was used in 2009 and 10 was by a bunch of Americans acting as if they were living in corporatist parts of Europe. People who thought that if they could drive a bargain between professionally run environmental organizations and some business leaders, that bargain could get through the U.S. Congress. That's never true. But it's especially not true in a presidency that was unfolding in recently unprecedented levels of social, racial, and ideological conflict, which is what happened in the first years of the Obama presidency. And it's particularly not going to be possible in an era in which the Republican Party in the United States, one of the two major parties, is being pulled to the ultra-right, far away from median public opinion, and in the direction of people who do not want to compromise in any way, shape, or form about positive government action in any sphere, particularly on global warming related issues. So it's the kind of misfit between political strategy and what was possible in a rapidly changing political landscape that I tried to unpack here. And then I tried to draw some conclusions, which I'll discuss today, about what this means about the future of U.S. national government action on global warming related issues, not just a carbon capping system, but other things. So let me present a little bit of the data that I dug up as I went about this. This is a particularly interesting exercise for me, and it was really an eye-opener. I had not really done a lot of research on environmental politics in the United States before I undertook this project. And one of the things I always want to do is put things in long-term perspective. Now, long-term can be hundreds of years, and when you're dealing with revolutions, when you're dealing with a legislative episode, it's 1970 to 2010, that's long-term. So what is in this figure? Let me just, the light-colored blue in the United States stands for Democrats or liberals. Red stands for Republicans or conservatives. Don't ask me why that's true. That's just the way it is in our conventional presentations these days. And the modern environmental movement in the United States kicked off in the early 1970s when there was Earth Day, 20 million Americans participating in Earth Day, the emergence of new environmental organizations, Sierra Club, remade, well, Sierra Club was actually a reinvented old one, Greenpeace, a series of others that, National Wildlife Federation, just dozens of smaller ones. That burst occurred in the early 1970s, and it's about that time that the Gallup poll organization started asking questions about public opinion on environmentalism in the United States. Now, it turns out that they have not asked the same question again and again, except in one case. There's exactly one question that they asked from the early 1970s to 2006, and that is whether you think that more or less should be spent by the federal government on environmental issues. If you've got to stick with just one question, that's not bad, because liberals and conservatives tend to split on spending money type issues. But if you look at the diamonds and the triangles that are not connected by the lines, you'll see that public opinion, yes, the Republican identified voters were responding somewhat more in the direction of less, but they were pretty close to a majority saying more. And Democrats were a little bit more. It's not really a picture of partisan polarization. For those first 20 years, really from 1970 up until about 1990, when environmentalism meant cleaning up the air, cleaning up the water, getting rid of toxic waste dumps. Those were the highly visible issues. Protecting animals and plants in the environment. Now, what are the solid lines? The solid lines are, I took advantage of the fact that over the same period, every year the major environmental organizations in the United States assemble in a meeting that the League of Conservation Voters runs and decide what are the key issues, the key votes in Congress, and what would be a pro-environmental vote and what would be an anti. They sometimes get down into the weeds even with amendments and things, so it's a pretty serious thing, but it represents the consensus of the environmental community each year about the key votes. And then how every single member of the House of Representatives and every senator votes on those is tallied. And you can come up with a score for individual members, you can come up with a score for the House, for the Senate, you can come up with a total score for Democrats and Republicans, which they reported for many years and then stopped reporting about 10 years ago. But in any event, this creates a time series over that same period that's basically a pretty good proxy for what elites are doing. Because these are elected legislators who are responding not just to voters and their opinions, but also to whatever advocacy groups or business groups are pushing them with ideas and money in their environment. And you can see that even in the 70s to the 90s, there was more partisan polarization in the legislature between Democrats and Republicans in terms of their average scores on environmental voting than there was among the voters. But it really wasn't a chasm. It's sort of what you'd expect from a slightly more pro-business party that's more wary of government action versus one that was warming up to the idea of doing more through government a little bit more. But then look at what happens after 1990. That's what I want to draw your attention to, because for me this was really an eye-opener when I put together these data. And by the way, I went to the League of Conservation Voters when this was all done and took the chart. And the head of the League of Conservation Voters said, "Wow, that's an amazing chart. We've never put together anything like that." Why not? They're your numbers. I think because they didn't want to see what is here. People don't want to see a lot of times. And 1990 is important because that's around the time that you begin to get international scientific reports saying that global warming is a major threat. And that's certainly around the time in the United States when the League of Conservation's voters' scores include a certain number of votes on global warming related issues, not just the air and water pollution stuff. It's also a crucial moment in that it's the Clean Air Act was amended in 1990 under a Republican president, George Bush Sr., the father of the recent Bush. And a bipartisan compromise was put together to add to the Clean Air Act in the United States a sort of cap and trade-like system for regulating sulfuric emissions that produced acid rain in the Midwest. So that's really that moment there where bipartisanship once again happened, as it had happened throughout the modern environmental era since the 1970s, happened under a Republican president, and created a model of market-friendly regulation and trading that became the model for the cap and trade people in the early 2000s. But look what happened after 1990, both to public opinion and to legislative voting behavior. Public opinion began to splay out and be a little bit more polarized than in the past, but not hugely more polarized than in the past, up through 2006. And actually the diamonds and the triangles are closer to the Democrats than they are to the Republicans. The Republicans sort of fell off a cliff there and stopped voting around 30 to 35% of the time for environmental priorities and got down as low as 10% or lower. If I were to put the leadership of the Republican Party into this chart, they would be at 5% to 0% in much of this period. So that was the first thing that I realized in my research, that the interviews I was doing with people to talk about what happened in the cap and trade, environmentalists were all saying, you know, our issue is not a partisan issue, they said. It's just scientific common sense that global warming is a threat, and all people of goodwill are happy to do something about it once they realize what the science says. Well, when I put this chart together, I realized, no, that's not really true. There had been an extraordinary degree of particularly elite level polarization for a long time leading into the period in the 2000s that set the stage for the battles when Barack Obama was elected president. Now let me move this forward. This picks up in the mid-2000s. The 2000s are important because Bush Jr. is in office, and certainly nothing is happening much on marshaling the federal government to address global warming issues, either through regulation or through legislation. But it is a period where bipartisan coalitions are forming, particularly in the US Senate, including a few people like John McCain and other Republican moderates who were prepared to cross over and essentially make up for the votes that you would lose on the Democratic side. It's also an important decade because public opinion for a while is beginning to move in the direction of thinking across the board that global warming is a serious threat and that active government intervention is needed. The questions that I am scoring here, the Gallup question, thinking about what is said in the news, in your view, is the seriousness of global warming generally exaggerated, generally correct, or is it generally underestimated? Higher scores here mean that they think it's an exaggeration. And the Pew question, from what you've read and heard, is there evidence that the average temperature on Earth has been getting warmer over the past decades or not? And I've got that ordered in the same way. So on this graph, higher means you're more into denial, that it's a serious problem, or at least that it's a serious human-caused problem. But for a little while there, in the middle of the decade, there was actually the beginnings of a possible convergence between the Republican identifiers and the Democratic identifiers in the electorate on thinking it was an issue. Yet another major UN report was issued that got a lot of visibility. Al Gore's movie was issued, and it got a lot of visibility. And he won a Nobel Prize. And from what we know, a lot of the indicators were moving in the direction of convergence on the idea that it was a serious problem and required action. But then it's as if a switch were thrown in the United States. There's a very interesting study whose data I used here, in which the political scientist Fritz Meyer went out and coded stories about global warming that appeared on all the television networks and on Fox News and on MSNBC, which is our more liberal cable network. And he particularly identified some that said global warming is a hoax, or it's an idea that liberals are using to impose regulations that'll kill the economy, versus stories that suggested it's a real problem. Most of the networks were moving in the direction of saying it was a real problem until right around the time the Al Gore movie started moving public opinion. And then all of a sudden, somebody sent down a new memo at Fox News. Now, Fox News is watched by about 30% of Americans. When Vanessa Williamson and I interviewed Tea Party activists, people told us, when we got to the question about where did they get their news, one man looked at me and said, "Not where you do." They acknowledged, in many cases, watching Fox News for 6 to 8 hours a day. And this is a network that, by its own accounting, makes very little distinction between news coverage, so-called, and interpretation. And Mayer coded their stories and showed that right after the Al Gore thing started happening, Fox started a steady drumbeat of stories suggesting that climate science was a hoax, scientists were trying to get rich, socialists were trying to use this idea to kill the American economy. And you can see the green is the proportion of those stories. Much more than in the networks. I used ABC, but I could have used any of them. They're all the same. And you can see opinion moving in a more conservative direction. Now, this is happening in 2006 and 2007. It's before Barack Obama moves into the White House. So it's not the further radicalization of grassroots Republican opinion that occurred after the Tea Party broke out in 2009 and 2010. Things get even more extreme at that point. The voting records are also moving in a discouraging direction from the point of view of those who want a bipartisan compromise, and I included Senator John McCain here because he was the moderate Republican that all the environmentalists who wanted a bipartisan coalition pointed to. And you can see that they were in love with the John McCain that existed around 2003, 2004, when he was running for president by trying to position himself to the moderate side of his increasingly right-wing party. But look what happened when he decided to run for president in 2007 and 2008, in the midst of the concerted campaign to shift public opinion on the right against global warming as a serious threat. He not only didn't join bipartisan coalitions anymore, he voted at the zero level on the whole range of priorities. There's also evidence that environmental issues in general were among the most polarized if you measure where Americans stood in 87 or 90, around there, and compare that to 2012. There are very few issues where polarization has grown as much as environment in this era. So part of what I concluded out of this work was that even before Obama came to the White House and the 2008 election appeared to open a window for a new push for a cap and trade system, public opinion had been transformed, particularly on the right, among Republicans who called themselves very conservative Republicans in those polls in the 2000s, and who would start calling themselves Tea Partiers after the Tea Party phenomenon broke out a few weeks into Obama's presidency. And if you look at what happened in the US Senate in 2010, it's very clear that a combination of big money on the far right, some of it given by organizations supported by the Koch brothers, not all of it, and voters who were convinced that climate change is a hoax and turn out for Republican primaries. That combination of top-down and bottom-up forces acting on Republican senators caused a huge shift toward overt denial arguments among elected US senators, and it caused those who had previously said it's a real problem and we should work together to solve it to drop their willingness to compromise. McCain is only one of several who was facing a Tea Party challenge from the right in a re-election bid that crucial year. Lindsey Graham as well. And they simply were not available for compromise. And yet, during this entire year, the major environmental organizations who were working with a few of the big polluting businesses to support cap and trade legislation never once noticed that popular opinion on the radical right was shifting and that the arguments in public were becoming increasingly polarized. Both sides in the battle for the US Congress in those crucial 2 years mounted ad campaigns. The ad campaigns run by the proponents of legislation said things like, we should all work together to solve a problem, and tried to reassure Americans in the middle who were worried about jobs and family incomes, particularly in a deep recession, that everything would be all right if this complicated law passed. Most Americans had no idea what was in the law, and the ads on the right were not soft. They were ads that said it's cap and tax. It will add $3,000 in cost to every family's budget for their electricity, home heating, and automobiles or trucks. I mean, this is a fantasy, but it doesn't matter. Those ads were precise and they were scary. And they were quite effective in further softening up public opinion. But in my analysis, I went a little deeper than that, because what struck me about the entire effort in the early years of Obama's presidency was that it was an entirely inside Washington, D.C. bargaining process. The idea that lay behind the cap and trade effort was that if you could just work out a bargain between environmentalists, not the left end of the environmental movement, but the big kind of professional environmentalists who are willing to support a market-oriented system of carbon controls, and some businesses, oil companies, electric generating companies, that would be enough to get bipartisan support in Congress. There was no investment whatsoever put into appealing to public opinion, trying to address the concrete worries of really the bottom 4/5 of the income range in the United States about the possibility that family costs could be raised if you increase the price of energy. So this was a very uneven fight. One side brought a nuclear bomb to the effort. And, I haven't laid this out, but they built on 2 decades worth of subsidized climate denial books and articles and presentations that had obviously had quite a bit of an effect at the elite level. But the campaign at the mass level was mounted coterminous with Al Gore's movie in the mid-2000s. And the other side thought that they could slip something complex through the US Congress without ever explaining it or mobilizing a broad coalition in support of it. In my report, I drew a direct contrast to the strategies that were used by the healthcare reformers, who were also fighting for a market-friendly, regulated system. The difference doesn't lie in the content of the policies, but in the health reform fight, there was a coalition that was built up that brought in unions, community groups, hospitals, physicians, and deliberately worked for 2 years to make sure that there were people in every legislative district and in every Senate, in every state, who could keep the pressure on to pass comprehensive health reform. In the end, they didn't get the health reform they wanted, but they played a very big role in pushing Obamacare over the top during the same period that the entire effort to carry forward with cap and trade was simply falling apart. So that was the analysis. Now, what lessons can be drawn from this? And here, I think, let me just lay out a few things and then open the floor for discussion. Right now, the mood among people who want to address global warming in the United States is more upbeat because Obama was reelected in 2012 after that disastrous election for his party in 2010, and the president has shown signs of talking more explicitly about the threat of global warming and encouraging action through regulation that the president can control. He managed to get his favored director installed at the Environmental Protection Agency and is giving clear signs that he will support tougher regulations on coal-fired electric plants, existing ones as well as new ones. Just announced more emission controls regulations that are going forward. In some ways, the environmental community, the big professionally run environmental community in the United States is delighted by this turn because it takes them back onto a terrain they're comfortable with. They spent 4 decades building up large expert organizations of lobbyists, scientists, and lawyers who are very good at pushing the EPA to do things. And President Obama is finally, I guess, realized that he's not going to get anything out of Congress, and so he's giving the green light, now that he doesn't face re-election, to quite a bit of action on the regulatory front. Many of you will also know that there's been a revival of kind of chain yourself to the fences style direct action in the United States, which is also very enjoyable to older environmentalists who remember the good old days when they chained themselves to fences. And environmentalists in the United States tend to be in their 60s. This is not a good sign. There is a student movement that is pressuring campuses to disinvest from carbon energy, and that's the youth wing. But most of the focus of the activists is on stopping the Keystone pipeline. And you probably have noticed that President Obama and his administration have done an elaborate, prolonged, highly ambiguous kabuki dance on the question of whether they're going to approve the pipeline. And I would say that the purpose of that has been twofold, one of which has already been achieved. They wanted to get it beyond the 2012 election without having to come down one way or the other on that question, because most Americans actually want the pipeline built. That's what the opinion polls say. I don't know how important that is, but it's what it says. But probably the other part of the strategy is to delay it and delay it and delay it, and therefore create a certain amount of discouragement in the companies that are investing in the related projects. I personally think in the end they will approve it. It's just at the end there'll be a while. And I could be wrong about that. But the significant point would be that for many on the environmental center and left, they have felt in the United States since 2010 that the quest for a market-oriented cap and trade system, which was led by the more business-oriented environmentalists under the Environmental Defense Fund, is not something they want to resume. They have instead turned back to traditional forms of action that are much more comfortable in the environmental movement. Professional lobbying on the one hand and direct action. With not a lot of connection between the two necessarily, except that I guess it's fair to say that the center and the left of the environmental movement in the United States are against Keystone. What happens going forward, though, with the original idea that there needed to be some system for changing the price of different kinds of energy production in this huge US economy? Now, I'll lay my cards on the table and say that I think that remains an important thing to do for the United States and for the world. The United States is a big energy producer and a big energy user. And so some form of increasing the price of carbon energy, of polluting energy, and of, at the same time, because that's the effect, encouraging other forms of energy to be used and innovated, remains important. That cannot happen through regulatory action alone, even if we assume that presidents will indefinitely be able to use EPA regulations without much support in Congress. Now, I'll leave you with two or three thoughts here. Regulatory action in the United States can only get somewhat ahead of legislative and popular majorities. If it gets too far ahead, there can be backlashes, and there are plenty of backlashes already. It's very difficult right now to get any money appropriated for the Environmental Protection Agency through the US Congress. And there are infinite possibilities for harassing people who work for those agencies, as long as Republicans retain control of even one house of Congress. So, if there's to be sustained regulatory action, let alone a movement towards some kind of new effort to legislate carbon pricing, again, that's going to depend on building a powerful movement linked to a congressional majority. Now, I don't think that congressional majority is going to be anything except Democrats, with a few stray Republicans. Because the big story in American politics in this period is the radicalization of the Republican Party. And I don't want to scare everybody here, but there are pretty much no limits to that radicalization. And even though there are a lot of people who want to believe that Obama's re-election in 2012 dealt a death blow to the Tea Party wing of the Republican Party, that is not true. There's been the slightest moderation in that the Republican leaders in the House and Senate decided not to shut down the US federal government again. They did it once and decided they won't do it again right now. And they decided not to plunge the world economy into a financial crisis. If that counts as moderation, then we're really in trouble. Because on all the other fronts where the forces at the right edge of the Republican Party are pushing for no compromise, pushing against any action, immigration reform, regulation and legislation to deal with global warming, let alone the various policies that might expand socioeconomic opportunity and security or even preserve what little we have in the United States. On all of those areas, Tea Party Republicans, both grassroots Tea Party people, who are half of all Republican identified voters, and the good citizen half, the ones that vote, and big money funders who are willing to fund challenges to the right for any office holder or candidate in the Republican Party that shows any sign of compromise on any of these issues. Those forces are still very much in play. They have ground the federal government in the United States to a halt in terms of its ability to do very much on any of these issues. They may very well be in a stronger position after next November than they are now. And so the future prospect is for a continuation of the kind of gridlock and asymmetric polarization toward the right. And until and unless the various centrist and moderate left forces in the United States that want action on some of these major global and national challenges learn to do something other than try to forge bargains inside Washington, D.C. that the citizenry cannot understand. Reestablishing an ability to build a broad coalition to make an argument is crucial, and in the global warming area, and this is where I'll wrap up, it's important to take into account how social and economic realities in the United States interact with people's ability and willingness to contemplate changes in the price of energy. In the United States, for the last 40 years, incomes have stagnated in the middle and in the bottom. That's basically the bottom 4/5 of Americans. At the same time that they're sending more adults into the workforce per family, are not seeing real income gains. All of the growth, in income and wealth has gone to the top. And you really can't go far enough up to the top to stop seeing that disproportionate gain. So that's the reality that people who want to make the case to Americans that they should support repricing energy have to deal with. This is from my colleague Steve Onsalabeher, who asked people making different income levels what more they'd be willing to pay on their electricity bills. And you can see that even the winners are not willing to pay as much as $25 a month. So the vast majority of Americans are going to have to be convinced that they can be economic winners or at least not economic losers in the coming energy transition. And that's why I think not only a new coalitional strategy is needed going forward, but a new policy. Cap and trade, at least as it was devised in the United States, is A, impossible to explain to ordinary people, and B, arouses deep suspicion, because all of the payoffs in the cap and trade approach go to polluting industries to try to persuade them not to raise the costs of, say, electricity as much as they might otherwise, as they bid for the right to spew out more pollution into the environment. I'm in favor of another approach, either a tax, ideally, simple carbon tax, or some kind of cap system with an auction and no free allowances, in which 80% or more of the revenues are simply recycled in the form of a check that's sent to every person every year. The calculations on that suggest that for the bottom 3/5 of American families, they'd come out ahead. And they'd do so in a way that's highly visible. A check in the mail. This system, by the way, exists in Alaska, not to fight global warming. You may have thought that Sarah Palin came from a state that was in favor of freedom from the federal government. Well, let me tell you, the state of Alaska gets more subsidies from the federal government than any other state in the United States per capita. And under Sarah Palin's governorship, they raised taxes on the oil companies, the royalties they pay for the right to drill in Alaska. And every September, I believe it is, every citizen of Alaska gets a check that Sarah Palin very carefully pushed up. Alaska has the most equal income distribution in the United States because it is a welfare state. And the dividends are very, very popular. That's the kind of system that, married to a broad coalitional effort, could, I think, potentially convince Americans that the transition to a new energy economy and all the business and job innovation that goes with that would leave average people coming out ahead and with more freedom and choices to make in the transition. There are a few senators and representatives, and there are a few groups that favor this idea. And I think it has the best chance to be ready for the next opening, if and when it comes. Okay, so I'll stop there.
Okay. Okay, perfect. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so thank you very much. Fascinating talk. Let's open it up, and if you could please identify yourself before you speak, who you are, your affiliation. Yes, down there. Down there. Oh.
And then a question I want you to draw some, speculate perhaps about some of the implications towards the end of your talk. The observation was motivated by, I was a consultant to the Office of Technology Assessment when I was a graduate student in Washington, D.C. in 1978. I had the opportunity to go see Carter's proposal. Cyrus Vance, the Secretary of State, made a proposal to the Joint Senate and House Committee on Energy to propose a variety of things to solve the American energy crisis of the late 70s. And it was fascinating because there was this massive public support, if I remember correctly, and I do believe I remember correctly, and indeed general support in the Democratic House and Democratic Senate. But when after Cyrus Vance made the proposal, or introduced a proposal to the Joint Committee, every single House representative and every single senator said, well, I support the president, and I do believe that we need to solve the energy crisis, but in my district. And it seems to me that there's always been a problem in American politics, that there's a large hiatus between the general support for broad principle like the environment, and that might cost my district some jobs. So I think you could overstate how similar they were in the beginning, that is the real political leadership. My question, though, is it seems to me that the Republican Party has shifted strategy in a way in which Ronald Reagan began, but which the Tea Party has truly mastered. And that it seems to me that they no longer want to fight over policies. They want to fight over the principle of government itself. And by that I mean, it seems to me that they have concluded that if people hate government at all, then they win politically. And so it's a reasonable strategy on their part to do everything they can to undermine people's, Boo Rothstein's, trust in government. So you've interviewed these people, you've talked with lots of these people. Do you think that really is the strategy?
Well, the Republican Party is a field of warring forces at this point. I mean, we're used to thinking in the United States of Democrats as all over the place and Republicans as militaristically disciplined. That's not what's happening right now. But the Tea Party, which I think of as a para-party movement that has disconnected but intersecting top-down parts and bottom-up parts, is all about pushing on Republican candidates and office holders to not compromise over the positive use of government in any way. Now, you know, I want to be a little bit careful. In our interviews with grassroots Tea Partiers, older, white, conservative-minded people who sometimes talk about Goldwater as if he were still with us. So they're kind of been on that edge for a long time. They certainly don't want to get rid of Social Security and Medicare and veterans benefits. They're all collecting Social Security, Medicare, and veterans benefits for the elderly. Their hatred of Obamacare is that it will be giving an undeserved set of benefits to freeloading minorities and low-income people and young people. There's a profound generational tension in the Tea Party at the grassroots. Now, the elite, big money people pushing ultra far-right ideas that call for the dismantling of Social Security and Medicare for the future, the elimination of regulation on business, let alone we don't want new ones, and the elimination of taxes. And you know, we just heard from an American billionaire the other day who would like votes to be allocated so that he has 1 million of them. And the working stiffs get far fewer. These are extreme ideas, some of which have been pushed for decades, some of which are kind of off the edge of the rails right now. But they don't necessarily agree entirely, those top-down and bottom-up forces, but what they do agree on is what you said. We want to throw sand in the gears of any kind of positive government action that would regulate the economy or tax and spend in ways that benefit the non-super wealthy. And they're very successful right now in much of that. But it's a war because there still are business forces, business organizations, that looked pretty extreme 10 years ago that now are saying, well, wait a minute. Do we really want to go that far? Do we really want to go so far as no infrastructure funding? Do we really want to go so far as no immigration reform? Because most business interests in the United States want immigration reform. And the Koch brothers, they don't care what the nationality of the workers they screw is. They are in favor of immigration reform to some degree. So it's a war that's going on in the Republican Party, but the kind of sweet spot, at least for the last few years, has been, well, we'll arouse these fears, we'll arouse these angers and these pressures against compromise and use that to ride to majorities. And that's still going on, especially in this upcoming election. Everybody in Europe needs to remember something about American elections. In presidential elections, at least the most recent ones, 3 out of 5 eligible voters go to the polls. That sounds bad, right? That's pitiful. But in midterm elections, when the president isn't on the ballot, it's only 2 out of 5 eligible voters who go to the polls on average. And they are older, white, conservative-minded people, including these grassroots Tea Party people who are very, very upset about the social and economic changes occurring in the United States and are convinced that global warming is a hoax. I attended a Tea Party meeting on the peninsula of Virginia in January of 2011 as an observer and listened to a 2-hour PowerPoint presentation, which I thought was incredibly boring. But the speaker presented environmentalism right down to the level of bike path planning as a decades-long conspiracy to impose socialism on America without admitting it. And the grassroots Tea Partiers in the room formed committees to go start harassing their town planning board and the Virginia legislature, as well as renewing the efforts to press Congress to stop the EPA in the immediate aftermath of that lecture. So at the grassroots, opposition to Obamacare as a giveaway to freeloaders and opposition to EPA action or global warming legislation are top priorities. Not to mention total opposition to creating a legal path to citizenship for the 11 million undocumented people living and working in the United States.
We have a question here, and then from there we take it together.
Okay.
Yeah, we can accumulate it.
Hello, I'm Laura Brunel. I teach political science at Gonzaga University in Spokane, Washington. We say Gonzaga, not Gonzaga, even though we're here in Italy. You were getting at some of the things I was interested there with your last comments about the manipulation of public opinion through this global warming as a hoax kind of narrative. You alluded to 2 decades of subsidized books and articles that presumably the extreme right have been able to produce. So could you say a little bit more about those subsidies or kind of how that machinery has been funded? Is it conservative think tanks or corporations or some kind of combination of the two that you see as the source of that? And then it leads to the bigger question to me of, is there really a role for science in this debate at all? I mean, can we actually win this on the basis of fact or scientific argument, or does it really have to be this ideological kind of a war?
Okay, the gentleman there, and then the one just in front.
I'm Bo Rothstein from University of Gothenburg in Sweden. Your explanation is very much centered on opinion change and money in politics. And I would just like to hear your opinion about the more institutional explanation. This comes from what the philosophers call the epistemic problem in democracy. We don't only want democratic decisions to be democratic, but also in some sense true and right. Now, the saying in development economics is getting to Denmark. Denmark is thought as the best governed country in the world. Now, there is a special thing with Denmark. When a Danish minister enters government, he or she brings 0 political advisors. They are completely surrounded by merit-recruited, sort of non-partisan civil servants. And we have collected data about this. Italy has most political advisors, then come the United States. And this is not an insignificant problem if you think about former South African President Thabo Mbeki. If he had been surrounded by expert scientists or merit-recruited bureaucrats instead of political cronies, he probably wouldn't have said the things he said about HIV/AIDS that seems to have costed about 340,000 South Africans their lives. Now, my question is this, and I'm an outside observer here, but when I listen to what Republican politicians are saying about environmental things and global warming, I think in at least the part of the world where I come from, it would have been impossible for even a very right-wing politician to say this, because he or she is constantly surrounded by experts or civil servants or researchers who would say, you cannot go out and say this. You would make yourself ridiculous. The scientific community will simply say no. So I think, is there maybe sort of the way the American political system is structured, that they are so much surrounded by political cronies that they get away with saying these things?
Just a third question, and then we'll turn it exactly there.
I am Roman Marimon, professor in the economics department. Just a simple question. I would have expected a talk like this a few years ago about a similar topic, maybe not by you, but similar, to talk quite a lot about lobbies. We have not heard anything tonight about lobbies. I was wondering whether they are not anymore in the picture. I understand the issue of the radicalization of the Tea Party, but I want to know what's your opinion, how much they play a role still.
Okay. Well, let me start with Boo Rothstein's point. Actually, institutions were all over my talk. I spoke about the Congress and its relation to the executive, and I said that American reformers in this effort, and many others, have tried to pretend that they're like corporatist Europeans. It's not just that European politicians are surrounded by scientists who whisper in their ears. It's that your institutions make it possible for a majority coalition to control the legislature and for citizens to figure out who's responsible for one thing or the other. The U.S. political system was deliberately created to not be like that, and there are some good things about not being like corporatist European systems. But when you intersect that with asymmetric polarization and the growth of extreme radicalism that's fueled both by certain kind of big money and by frightened people, because that's what Tea Partiers at the grassroots are. They're often very nice people. I used to have to take a Tylenol at the end of the day after the interviews because I liked the people I met, with a couple of exceptions. But they were saying awful, awful things. Hateful things, things based on fear, and things based on, how to put it politely, a total disconnect from the facts. Now, the question came up about whether science has a role to play. Of course it does. I'm a social scientist. I believe I spent my life in the university. I teach students. Of course, the truth, the factual truth, and powerful theoretical interpretations of the truth matter. But politics is not fundamentally about the facts. And I don't like to make, atemporal generalizations, but I'll make one. Politics is about who we are and who they are, and politics is as much a matter of dealing with threats as it is achieving aspirations. And in the US right now, a series of institutional configurations have come together to make it much easier for the far right to create a sense of threat. And, we're dealing with a generational transition in the United States. One of the students at Cornell said to me, well, you've told me they're all older people, so the problem will be over soon, right? Yeah. Well, I guess so, depending on how you look at it. I mean, I'm the same age as the Tea Party people, and when I went to meetings, I could blend right in. But, these are healthy people, and they vote. So they're not going to be gone for a while. And the spectacle of generational tensions in the United States over issues of nativism, which are not unknown in Europe, but which intersect with the welfare state in a very different way in the United States because of the fact that we have one that's generous for the old and completely inadequate for working-aged and younger people. And Barack Obama was trying to change that. And that's how you get the spectacle of people collecting government checks that they feel very entitled to, who are determined to make sure that other people don't get anything that might be at their expense. I think on the global warming front, the fact that, regulatory politics can be fairly powerful in the United States, it was. The United States was in the lead in health and safety regulation and environmental regulation. Read the book of David Bogle. He's done some very good work on that. But that's flipped in recent times. There was a certain kind of political and legislative and movement coalition that was put together in the 70s that created regulatory agencies that could be pretty autonomous and pretty effective in a number of spheres, as long as they had at least a minimum level of protection from Congress and presidents. But that's fast eroding now. And the form of conservatism that's unfolding in the United States right now is not conservative by any stretch of the word. It is ultra government bashing extremism. And it's not, this will arouse anger when I say it. It's not primarily driven by traditional business lobbies. Now, I just want to signal to you that this is an area where I maybe don't completely agree with, for example, even my good friends Jacob Hacker and Paul Pearson. I think their book, which I just taught to my Inequality in American Democracy seminar, is a brilliant book, Winner Take All Politics. And it argues that simultaneous with the decline of labor unions in the United States, you had the pulling together of trans industry business coalitions that were able to really go on the warpath against the kind of regulatory apparatus that came out of the 70s. And I think that's correct. But that's kind of, you know, I'm nostalgic for the Chamber of Commerce at this point. That's so yesterday. Since the mid-2000s, we've had the rise of a kind of ideological radicalism at the top, which is really fueled by billionaire loners. Now, there are some billionaire loners. Remember, the United States led the world in the financialization of the economy and the generation of fabulous wealth at the top. So we now have a situation in which it's not so much a question of what industries want or what coalitions of industries want, but we've got people with way too much money in their hedge fund accounts. Some of them, blessedly, are on the left. I mean, there's a billionaire, Tom Steyer, who's running all kinds of ads about global warming and trying to elect people that think that's a serious issue. But 3/4 or more of them are on not just the right, but the no limit to the fantasies right. And they are not necessarily grounded in any kind of communities or industries with actual workers or actual consumers. It's not incidental that some of these are oil billionaires. And they have channeled money. Now, I want to answer your question by saying that in the full paper that I wrote, the report, I drew on the research of people like Riley Dunlap and Robert Brule. I happen to lead an organization that has been built over the last few years called the Scholars Strategy Network, and I advise all of you to click on the website. We just enrolled our 370th professor from around the United States. It's an organization that is devoted to the idea that people in all fields should be able to boil down their research and their knowledge into 2 pages of plain English that any average person can read. This is a startling idea in American academia, because we've got lots of scientists and lots of academics in the United States, but they're all talking a private language that nobody can understand. And this group, which has been growing leaps and bounds and now has 15 chapters and is soon going to have 18 chapters, including chapters in places like Oklahoma and Texas and Louisiana. We're not just on the liberal coast. Anyway, we have 2-page briefs, and we have a whole set of them if you go to the Scholars Strategy Network.org website, that in 2 pages sum up some of the best research on some of the things that I've talked about today, including climate denial. And the best researchers in that area have worked their tails off to try to track down the trails of money going into climate denial. One of the slides I didn't show today shows that starting about 1990, climate denial books and reports published in English shot up. And they shoot up coterminous with the radicalization of the Republican elite moving right. And of course, then there was more of a media strategy after you get Fox News into the picture. This stuff is put out, in some cases, by the standard right-wing think tanks. Sometimes it's put out by special organizations that are created simply to raise questions about climate and environmental stuff. These are usually not university-based scholars in any way, shape, or form. They might be the occasional 1 in 1,000 maverick who sees the chance to make a lot of money. But they are put out as if they were reports in order to create the impression that there's dissent among scientists about things that there's really no significant dissent about. And Brule and Dunlap, in their separate studies, have found that there's definitely some carbon industry money going into it, usually very disguised, laundered through third parties. But there's also some money just from these extreme ideologue billionaires who aren't necessarily responding to any organizational imperatives at all. They're just doing their thing.
Okay, I see some hands. So two right there, yes. Again, if I can remind you to identify yourselves.
Hi. Hello? I'm sorry. I'm Thailand, visiting student from University of Wisconsin-Madison. I have a question about the role of the states actually here. You hashed out few alternatives how to get in front of this rising right-wing movement, and I was wondering whether is there possible avenues to do starting on the state level, then making the jump to the federal level, considering the fact that California, if not I'm mistaken, passed a cap and trade law in the past few years. And my second question is, even after the plummeting popularity of the GOP and the all-time low popularity of the Congress, do you still think that nothing would come out of the midterm elections in this November? You kind of implied that you really don't expect much from this November elections, but I'm still asking, with the low popularity of the GOP, especially after the shutting down of the government a few months ago. I mean, I'm asking this as a so that you can speak out to that more explicitly. My question is about the states, the role of the states, and how they can influence the federal policies.
Well, I mean, I'll make a comment on the national scene. It's based on what's become clear in the last month or so, that the Republican leadership in the Congress is not going to move on anything, including things that they might think are important for their long-run prospects. I mean, we can talk about the Republican Party as if it was an it that made decisions, but that's not really right. I mean, first of all, U.S. political parties, and this is an institutional and organizational point, are always loosely coupled. But right now, the Republicans are so loosely coupled that the Speaker of the House can't assemble a majority for anything. The only thing he can assemble a majority for is passing symbolic repeals of Obamacare. And right now, ironically, the Republican Party is convinced that in a low turnout midterm election, they can squeak through to the control of the U.S. Senate and hold on to their majorities in the House simply by talking about how awful Obamacare is. I don't know whether they're right about that or not. I can tell you that Obamacare is here to stay. It's not going anywhere. If Republicans, as they are currently constituted, take control of the Senate by a small majority, Barack Obama will want to move to some other country for the next 2 years. But in the long run of history, the things that his presidency has put in place and accomplished are not going anywhere. The next real decision point is 2016, when the presidency is up for grabs. Now, can there be progress in the states and even metro areas or institutions? Yes, and actually you're seeing, especially on the move toward renewables, and even in kind of carbon capping, sort of, you're seeing some movement. But in America, what counts above all is to get into the Midwest. If you can't get off the coast, you're not ultimately going to be able to change the parallelogram of forces in national politics. And the state of Wisconsin is a very cautionary tale for what has happened. The state of Wisconsin, used to be a reliably moderate liberal state. It has been taken over by just as hard right forces practically as the forces that have taken over the state of North Carolina, where you expect it, or Texas, which, you know, it's practically its own self. So somebody earlier said that, you know, I think it was Sven, if you read the full analysis that I'm offering here, I'm actually offering a way to get at Midwestern Democrats, both to elect them and to get them to move. I think they're the ones that are movable. You can forget about coal and oil state Republicans and Democrats. And West Virginia, where my sister lives, is hopeless. I mean, I don't care whether they're called Democrats or Republicans, they're never going to support anything that has to do with environmental or global warming or any of these matters. But Ohio, Illinois, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Michigan, that's where the action is. And if somebody like the senator from Ohio, whose name I'm blocking on right now, is a good liberal, if Sherrod Brown could get to the point where he could see advantages for enough of his constituents in a dividend system that he could stiff arm the electric utilities, then you're somewhere. So I think policy and political strategy and institutional openings all have to be thought of together. And the full report that I wrote for the Rockefeller Foundation is a profoundly institutionalist argument. It's an argument about facing up to the realities of what's blocked and what's possible in the interaction of opinion, social movements, and institutions in American politics. I certainly think that changes in the states could add up, but they won't be enough if they're just happening on the coast.
Yeah, we got a question back there.
I'm Michael Donnelly. I'm a Max Weber Fellow. I was wondering if you could talk a bit about the strategic considerations that went into choosing to make Keystone such a big issue. It strikes me that there were a lot of options out there that the environmental movement could have chosen as the sort of big issue, the next big issue, and I wonder why you think they've chosen that one.
Well, you know, this is one where I haven't done the same kind of research that I did on the cap and trade fight, where I actually talked to people. Of course, I follow the press and talk some with folks. I mean, I don't remember it even being a question where people, I don't think there's a lot of strategy that goes into any of this. That's discouraging, actually. I was very struck in the work that I did on the cap and trade episode, where I was talking to people in a policy arena where I haven't done a lot of work before. I was struck at the amazing naivete about politics. I mean, I had people saying to me, this isn't a partisan issue. Or, gee, it's so interesting, that figure you put together. Well, why wouldn't you want to do that? And then if I ask myself, well, what is it that organizations do in the business world, in the university world, in the advocacy world? They want to define issues and define the next struggle in their comfort zone, what they feel good about doing. And I think the Keystone thing emerged as very much a comfort zone thing for the left edge of the environmental movement, because, first of all, it's big and visible. They were thrilled that there were some farmers in Nebraska who were, you know, against it, so they could see a popular component. And these are not organizations that really have a lot of popular roots right now. And for some of the ones in the environmental community, like the Sierra Club and Greenpeace and some of the student groups, both old and young, it's thrilling to be able to have a public demonstration and to get yourself arrested. I mean, people are really pleased to be arrested after they chain themselves to the White House fence. And it seems almost cruel to say, well, is this really doing a lot of good? I don't have the courage to say that to people. So even if I were interviewing them, I don't think I'd be able to ask that question. But if you back up, you might want to say, do you really want to invest in this as the major make or break, because let's say it drags on for another several years and then it gets approved. Well, where are you then? What have you laid the basis for? Now, I'll contrast that to the Sierra Club's campaign against coal plants, new and existing. I think that's a direct action campaign that actually does put in place building blocks that could lead to the larger questions and the alliances that could feed into another attempt to do carbon capping. But that kind of thinking about how where you invest now leads to something later, I don't see that in the U.S. environmental movement. And I see it a lot less in that movement than I see it in the healthcare sector, where they really spent a lot of time thinking about what went wrong in 1993-94, and they, across the board, came up with strategies to do better the next time.
Okay, perfect. If there's no other burning question, maybe we can continue chatting over a couple of drinks. And please join me in a round of applause.
Thanks for great questions and comments. Very good ones.
Thanks very much. Yeah, I wonder, I mean, one of your slides, that is not the one that's there, seemed to show that, I mean, what's happened even on the right, the Republican Party has gone much more.
Oh, yeah. So, and even before this episode, they
Sure. So, I mean, when you said that you thought what was needed was to change public opinion, I wondered, I mean...
Public opinion, not on the right. I mean, I probably should have made that clear. I mean, I would spend zero time trying to persuade conservative-minded Republicans.